everybody, welcome back to our cast of the semi-final playoffs between BlackCherries and Tolaasin. This is game number 2. If you have not watched the epic game number 1 yet, be sure to check it out. Alright, so if you have checked it out, you would have known that Tolaasin is 1 game ahead in this best of 3. So this could be the match-winning game for Tolaasin. Joining me to commentate this game, as always, is Tris. Hi, Tris.
Hey Ben, nice to be back.
Hope you have recovered from the previous game. That was a
blast.
Wow,
such a mind-blowing game. I'm still on a high from that game. It was a fantastic showcase for fun netrunner.
Well, hopefully you can maintain the high as we jump into this game.
I don't know, Ben. It's going to be a struggle with personal evolution, or it's going to be hard to maintain that kind of happiness.
Do you have a personal vendetta against it?
Back when I was playing at our local meetups in the UK, I had a friend who used to bring PE every week just to torment me because she knew that just putting the PE identity down would put me on tilt, because she had an uncanny habit of always forcing me to run into traps and kill myself. So yes, I am not a fan of this ID, but it's very good for the game. So it'll be exciting to see this match.
This isn't, Mushin style all ambushers, guessing game, psychic field PE. This is proper gentleman's PE, shall we say?
Yeah, insofar as PE can be gentlemanly, I'll give you that.
Okay.
To be fair, it is actually a very interesting PE build. I mean, relying on the Grail Ice is, I think, an inspired choice, particularly for newer players. One of the explanations we gave when thinking through this deck and then playing it for the showcase videos was talking about the fact that it forces runners to not run without at least access to all of their breakers. And it can make it very, very hair-raising for a runner to go and face plant into unknown ice, because that can be really nasty for them and can get really bad really quickly.
Yeah, and it's because of that, along with all the cool options that this particular PE deck has available, is the reason why it's actually my favorite sparring deck of the whole lot. So I guess today I can swoon all over PE and you can be the devil's advocate.
Yep, I think that good cop, bad cop routine will work out just fine for us.
Awesome. Alright, so how do you rate these hands? Starting with PE, we have a hand full of upgrades, assets, and a celebrity gift.
So this is an interesting one, because I might be tempted to keep this hand. Not to play the celebrity gift immediately, but the fact that you've got a breach dome that you can immediately pitch turns Alice's ability into something that Tolaasin is not going to want to utilize often in this game. The upgrades, I'm not sure you really want them right now. Hokusai Grid is not terrible because it's very difficult for the runner to contest early. So slapping that on something like R&D to keep that a little bit safe is good. The fact that you've got a Cortex lock is, I think, one of the reasons why I would consider this a keep hand, because that's the kind of ice that you want early, because it can allow you to get out an early overcounter if you want. It can allow you to lock down a server to protect it, because the runner's not going to want to go faceplant into it, and certainly not going to want to pay the 6 credit cost to get through with MK Ultra. That's definitely not something that they want to be doing. So while the runner is relying on a single breaker, maybe 2, that's a good piece of ice to have. So this, for me, I'd be tempted to keep, but I can see an argument for throwing it back and hoping to try and hit a little bit more money, a little bit more in terms of useful cards that you can slap down immediately.
I think that was a very solid analysis. I think there must have been some part... I mean, the Breach Dome interaction with Alice is probably one of the big reasons why BlackCherries brought this particular deck to the matchup. If so, it is a very inspired choice. You can, as you said, basically turn off her identity ability once you drop a Breach Dome in Archives. And again, as you mentioned, the Cortex Lock is something you don't really want to show the runner. You want to put it down and hope they run into it without the correct breaker. Even if they do, it's pretty expensive to break with, say, MK Ultra. And the upgrades, as you mentioned, yeah, they are very strong, make no mistake. They're just not exactly what you want to use right now. What about Tolaasin's hand? Some very strong run-based pressure cards in indexing and dirty laundry.
So
breakers?
here's the thing, right? This goes back to what we said in game one, that what you're always looking for in a runner hand to try and sort of make the initial consideration about whether you mull or keep is, do I have some money? Do I have some draw? This hand meets both those criteria. The risk is that your money is run-based, which against any form of Jinteki deck can be just the worst. You need to be very, very careful about playing those kinds of cards. The fact that he's got indexing might lead me to be tempted to keep this kind of hand. Indexing is going to be a very important weapon that he's got against this PE deck, because it's going to allow him to avoid breach domes in R&D and decide when it's okay for him to steal an agenda. One of the things that's very, very dangerous about this PE deck is that stealing an Oberkarte can be fatal, because you take your 4 net damage plus the additional 1 from PE. So you don't want to do that at the end of the game, at the end of the turn, because it's a single neural EMP, and that's the flat line that loses you the game. So, you know, it's useful to have that indexing because it gives you the ability to make those considerations. Double breach dome in the bin. Oh, this is a fantastic start for PE.
Unfortunately, no eyes on R&D means of guaranteed indexing.
Turn 1 indexing.
Tolaasin.
There we go. Of course, Tolaasin can't steal 3 of the agendas in the deck at this point. He cannot steal any Oberkartes because he will be flatlined if he does. So if he sees them, he's got a very difficult choice to make. Do I draw up 1, run again and steal, or do I just let it go? I don't know. I think he can afford to lose this hand at this point. These are not cards that are particularly vital to this matchup at the moment. The Earthrise is good and it's important, but you know, it's not something that you are particularly concerned about losing. You can always manually draw.
Yeah, I think the ordering is important here. He doesn't want to play the Earthrise first, going all the way down to 1 credit.
No, absolutely not. Not going down to 1 credit, not going down to 3 cards.
Yeah, so they play the Dirty Laundry here. Oh, it's a House of Knives on R&D.
That's a good snipe. That's not an agenda you want to allow this PE deck to steal, because as we mentioned with the Oberkarte, stealing that is incredibly hard. You need at least 5 cards in hand to do it. A House of Knives makes it virtually impossible to take 1 off R&D because you take so much net damage in order to do it. So, important early snipe for Tolaasin. I mean, certainly not game-winning, but it's a good start.
For sure. On the flip side, a bit of an issue I have with BlackCherries' turn 1 play, which, by the way, was draw a card and take 2 credits, was that they were forced to ditch 2 cards at the end of their turn. And that makes it very obvious that the 2 cards in the bin are breach domes, which is a very clear signal for Tolaasin never ever to run archives again. Unless they suspect an agenda, of course.
I think drawing was probably a mistake. I might have just installed the Cortex lock on R&D and taken 2. That way you avoid tossing anything into the bin immediately, and you allow Alice to go and make that mistake for herself, to go run the archives, force you to discard a card, hit the breach dome, and that's the end of it. Now, it's interesting that Tolaasin plays the Hacktivist meeting here, because there are only 2 cards in this deck that Hacktivist affects. Ben Musashi and Hokusai Grid. That, coupled with the fact that PE doesn't really care that much about cards going into archives, particularly because, you know, so long as they're not agendas, you don't really mind. I'm not sure I'm wild about spending a credit and a card to not get that much value. Certainly not at the moment.
Yes, I agree with your sentiment there. Although it seems like a very small cost, right? A click, a card, a credit. No big deal. But in very close games, this can be the game maker or game breaker, as the case may be.
I mean, I suppose the saving grace for Tolaasin is that he's got 2 I've had worses in hand, and that's going to help him a lot in terms of trying to steal agendas, particularly spiky ones like Oberkarte. That's going to soften the blow quite a lot. So BlackCherries is drawn into a brain trust. Do you slam and jam here and go for the score? Or do you play a bit more passively?
So going back to what you said about Grail Ice, you know, one of the biggest strengths is that you can threaten any of the subtypes, Barrier, Sentry, Code Gate. And as far as I know, Tolaasin doesn't have all 3 in the bin right now. So they can't be confident about running into the server, even if it's an agenda. As you can see here, Tolaasin just has to let it go, as BlackCherries will probably score the brain trust here.
There we go. Nice. I think that's the right call. And it's especially notable that one of the things I mentioned at the start was that having a celebrity gift is particularly useful for PE. You want to be able to afford to raise your ice. Merlin's not cheap. No. And you want to be able to sort of like threaten traps and that kind of thing. We know that this deck is only running Breach Dome as a trap, but you don't want to be poor as a Jinteki deck ever. And so what's nice about having the celebrity gifts in hand is that it gives you the option later on to bounce back quite quickly after you've scored an agenda. And what's interesting is that he hasn't bothered to demonstrate or to show Tolaasin anything in his hand just yet. So there's a lot of advantage to the fact that he's got 4 pieces of ice that are unknown on the table and still has the ability to show Tolaasin the hand next turn potentially and bounce up quite quickly in credits.
Agreed. Yeah, this hidden information aspect of the game is particularly important, and yeah, you can't overstate its importance. I think BlackCherries is doing a fantastic job of managing information in terms of hiding the identities of the ice, making it very difficult for Tolaasin to pick the correct server to run because they don't know what nasty ice lie in store for him.
And I think what's potentially quite important is also that he's now shown him the first piece of Grail. Now, this is not to say that Tolaasin doesn't know that there's Grail in the deck, but Tolaasin now has to be very careful because if a Merlin is on any server, not only will he take the net damage, he can't actually get in. Because the Grail, the Galahadness in BlackCherries' hand will stop him dead. So now's the time, I think, for BlackCherries to capitalize, throw the House of Knives in the remote. Tolaasin assumes that that's the brain trust, can't contest it, and BlackCherries then gets to score a very powerful agenda that's going to give him some good forward momentum in the game.
Yes, and it seems like BlackCherries is listening to your every word. I do agree with the House of Knives jam. You definitely want to push out agendas while you still can, but Tolaasin seems to not care. Going for the remote here, gonna hit a Galahad, which he can break.
I think this is a bold play, not necessarily the worst play, largely considering that while we said a Merlin could be quite bad because he takes 2 net damage and still can't get into the server, it's worth pointing out that there's nothing really in his hand that's particularly important. In addition, he might also be able to, just eat the net damage and gain the I've had worse advantage. Plus, as you'll have noticed, BlackCherries spent 5 credits raising the Komainu. If that had been a Merlin, that's 1 additional credit, taking him down to 4 credits. And the celebrity gift is a lot less useful now that he's only got 3 cards in hand. So this, I think, was a bold play, but arguably not the wrong one from Tolaasin. Especially given that he mills an agenda with a hacktivist and manages to grab the House of Knives out of the remote.
Yeah, so the agenda mill is actually quite interesting. I would actually argue that it was a good thing for BlackCherries that the Brain Trust hit the bin, because the bin is actually a less appealing server to run than HQ right now. As you can see, Alice is slowly but surely installing her programs. Very soon, with 1 more program on the board, she can run HQ for free.
Sure, that is fair. That is, and I mean, it's interesting to note also that Tolaasin didn't bother to take the House of Knives, instead going back in for a second time so that he avoids the Ben Masashi tax. I think that's wise, given that he doesn't really want to take more net damage than he needs to. It's expensive. Having to go through Komainu twice and pay, 6 credits to get through a second time so that he avoids net damage is not particularly great. But with 2 liberated accounts on the board, not the worst decision in the world.
Yep.
And then we go for another slam. I really like this kind of aggression from PE. This is the way that you put the runner under pressure and force them to keep burning away their own tempo. Because Alice's hand is not particularly large at the moment. 3 cards. In Tolaasin's defense, BlackCherries doesn't know that one of them is I've had worse. But, to take more net damage could be really bad for him here.
Yes, I mean, especially because assuming the I've had worse isn't in play, the Komainu into Hokusai Grid is a fatal combination if Alice cannot break the Komainu. And Alice isn't that rich now. So this is a tricky one. On the other hand, Alice does know that there used to be a Brain Trust in HQ. So this could very well be the Brain Trust in the server, and there's very good reason to run that server.
I think Tolaasin is suspecting that, and I think that that's a good assumption to make. largely because the worst possible case scenario for him is it's a Hokusai breach dome. I think as the PE, as BlackCherries, you don't really want to be throwing your breach domes into the remote if you can avoid it, because they have more value in archives, turning off Alice's ability. So I think given the information that Tolaasin's got about BlackCherries' hand, he could make a fairly safe bet that there is an agenda here.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think Breach Dome can be underrated as a remote ambush. I would certainly jam it in the remote here if I had it in my hand, which goes back to BlackCherries' play earlier of ditching both Breach Domes immediately on turn 1. If he had one of them in their hand still, that might have been a chance to inflict a lot of hurt on Tolaasin between the Hokusai Grid, the Komainu, and the Breach Dome. Unfortunately, the House of Knives was the only thing, so now it's a very awkward position where Tolaasin knows there's a brain trust somewhere unaccounted for.
I think the fact that Cherries is spending clicks to draw up is going to do one of two things in Tolaasin's head. It's either going to suggest to him that the brain trust is already in archives and that he's drawing up because, you know, he's looking for something else that he can jam in the remote, or it suggests that it's the last remaining card in hand and that he's drawing up in order to try and pad out the hand to prevent him from stealing it and getting, you know, to match point.
Exactly.
I think it's a difficult read, but certainly from my personal experience playing PE decks, and particularly the sparring PE deck, drawing up is normally the sign that PE is looking for an agenda rather than trying to protect one, largely because you don't really care that much if runners steal your agendas, because it's often very, very difficult to do that. So it's a tricky one because it would put Tolaasin on match point, but I think Tolaasin might be quite confident that the brain trust is now sitting in archives. Of course, he's also going to be confident that there will be a trap in archives waiting for him, so he's not going to run that server anytime soon.
Yeah, as we see a run on R&D here. I was about to say, I think R&D could have used a bit less ice here. It's always hard to say, but when you have a lot of unrest ice sitting on one server, you have to ask yourself, would those ice have been served better somewhere else? In this case, perhaps in the scoring remote.
Yeah, I think particularly because you've lost that Galahad on the scoring remote, the Komainu is, you know, it's a good piece of ice that's pretty taxing, but it's also porous. It doesn't stop the run. And now we start to see the power of running HQ with Bagat straight through that Cortex lock because it's now completely blank. And it's one of the things that you'll notice is that in a lot of games, once once Imp is empty, the temptation for the runner is to overinstall it so that they can get it back with something like Retrieval Run. In this game, it's one of the few instances where you desperately want to keep that Imp on the board, even though it's empty, because it allows you to turn off the Cortex lock, which is such a pain to have to break with MK Ultra. It's so bad.
Yeah, so as you see, because HQ is basically free right now, thanks to Alice being on full memory, she's just hammering it every turn, looking for the unaccounted for brain trust, which is obviously sitting in the bin.
Well, I don't even think it's necessarily that bin. I mean, the fact that he's got Bagat down means that there is now lots of value to being able to run HQ, because you're milling cards from R&D, you're denying BlackCherries options. It's looking bad. It's looking bad for him. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure how he gets out of this.
Well, this could be a way, if Tolaasin doesn't contest the Philotic Entanglement here. That's going to be a lot of net damage coming his way, given that he has stolen
that's four net damage, and it means that he has to take a turn off. An ideal here for BlackCherries, and something that would allow him to win this game, is to score the Philotic, the next turn draw immediately into an Obercaster Protocol and slam and jam, because Tolaasin has to spend a turn recovering from a Philotic being scored, because he will lose his entire hand at this point. As Tolaasin, it's potentially fatal for him now to install something, to go down to 3 cards, because that immediately flatlines him. And it doesn't look like he's particularly keen on contesting server 1 at this point. He might do, but I think it's a little bit dangerous to do this last click.
Nope. Yeah, it is pretty risky.
I think he's going to let this go, and I understand that you want to try and play quite carefully as any runner, but especially against some form of net damage PE. But this is going to be a pretty big turn for BlackCherries to score this Philotic, because 4 net damage is nothing to sniff at, even if it hits the I've had worse, because Tolaasin's stack is not particularly full. I mean, 16 cards it's enough that he can still make a go of this game, but he's starting to get to the point where it gets a little bit dangerous.
Now here's I think this
is a huge mistake here. To try and bluff this out as an Obokata, I think is a mistake. I would have scored this immediately.
So I think BlackCherries thinks that he cannot win on agenda points. So he's going for the net damage win here. 4 net damage on the Philotic and 2 more with the Neuro EMPs in hand. I like this courage. I think, as you said, I don't really see any way BlackCherries is gonna pull this game out in the late game.
See, I'll be honest. I don't know if I agree with that, because I think Tolaasin definitely contests this. Because it's not an Obokata, he doesn't get into net damage range. So you can't kill him with the neural EMPs. And the big problem that you've got with not scoring this Philotic entanglement is that you don't force Tolaasin to spend a turn recovering. He's going to be quite easily capable of stealing this agenda, and I think BlackCherries has basically then ceded any advantages he's got, because he can no longer bluff out agendas in server 1. And the fact that he's losing Philotic, one of the agendas that he actually desperately wants to score, rather than something like a Brain Trust, which doesn't really do much for him if he scores it, I think this sets him back a lot more than it gives him the chance to win the game.
Sure, but I honestly don't see much that BlackCherries can do if they score the Philotic. So they're on 4 points, they need to score an Obokata to win anyway, and Tolaasin can easily contest future Obokatas.
See, but the thing is, contesting a future Obokata still doesn't win Tolaasin the game. That's the important thing. But it does sap a lot of tempo. So having an Obokata that you can slam to the remote, then follow that up with a second one, I think is a riskier line to take, but I think one that actually leads to you winning the game, rather than trying to double advance here and go for it. Now, the one thing what I will say is that the one thing that does make the strategy somewhat work is the fact that Tolaasin's quite poor. So contesting the Komainu is incredibly difficult. But I might have been tempted here to just eat the net damage. If it's an Obokata protocol, cool story. I mean, BlackCherries is still not winning this game. And you've always got the possibility.
So BlackCherries actually pulled it off. Tolaasin ended the run. They did not dare to continue because the sentries were too expensive. But because of the ordering, BlackCherries chose to fire the Philotic before the Neuro EMPs. BlackCherries had no shot at flatlining Tolaasin, who happened to have the last I've had worse in hand. That is a very interesting turn of events.
Well, scratch what I said. I think that boldness being paid off is definitely like a fantastic thing. I'm always pleased when bold plays that you don't think from first glance will win actually work out. That's the kind of net runner you really want people to be playing. And of course, what it's meant is that Tolaasin is starting to run really low. That stack is 10 cards, 4 in hand. He's going to need at least 5 in order to steal the Obokata protocol. And with 2 neural EMPs in hand, it's getting dicey.
It is. I'll talk a bit more about...
Oh, and a Kakugo hits the hand.
Yeah, the Kakugo. That's the ice that you want to see right now. An ice that forces the net damage. Don't forget, Alice used her knife earlier on a Galahad. So there are no more knives in play. The Kakugo is always going to deal damage.
So I don't know if I agree with the decision to install it on HQ here. I think now's the point at which you want to try and go, as you said, for the flatline victory. So I think throwing it on the remote, double advancing an Obokata protocol behind it, because that's what you're going to do. As soon as you draw into that Obokata protocol, you're going to install and double advance it in that remote. And if you've got the Kakugo on the remote, that's what sets up the flatline victory. The alternative to it is to install an R&D and prevent Tolaasin from being able to steal it from R&D easily. But I think given how few cards he's got in hand, That's difficult.
So I think BlackCherries at this point was seriously worried about either being decked out due to Bagat or losing too many agenda points to archives, which is, I think, a perfectly fine reason for placing Kakugo on HQ. Unfortunately, as you said, this means that he loses the capability to drag Alice through the remote to get an Obo Kata or to R&D to do the same. So that is a bit of a problem, as you mentioned, and one that will make this an uphill battle for BlackCherries.
Yeah, because the biggest danger that he's got is that slamming an Obokata in the remote is incredibly difficult, because Tolaasin can just spend 3 clicks to draw up, go and run and steal it, because he knows that anything that's double advanced has to be an agenda. There's nothing else in...
Yeah, Tolaasin's going to run the bin here.
I don't know.
I'm not sure about this play. I'm not sure at all.
So he's going to see that there's an Obokata in the bin.
Is there?
Yeah, and as far as I remember, there's also the brain trust that was there earlier. So this does give him the option
to win the game.
To potentially win the game, apparently.
Yes. So
of course, because he's not going to take the damage from the breach domes because he can choose his axis order.
Yes. So the brain trust would deal 1 net damage, and the Obokata would deal 4 net damage. You would get extra net damage from the identity, but Tolaasin wins before the net damage is dealt. So that's how it goes.
Yeah, well, I mean, like an interesting game. Certainly one that I think looks a lot closer than the agenda points would suggest it is. It's a tricky one for BlackCherries, because I think he got into a position where Alice had stolen too many agendas for him to do the thing that you really want to do as PE, which is throw down cards into the remote, force the runner to keep running, keep taking net damage over and over again to keep checking things. And it meant that he had to go for a very, very convoluted win strategy that I still am not sure he could have pulled off.
Exactly, but I think I still say that's the right play, and I think even though BlackCherries lost, I have to give him huge props for at least attempting that philotic kill.
That was really cool, I must admit. I mean, the fact that he didn't trigger the neurals first, it's the kind of mistake that I make all the time, forgetting to trigger things in certain orders, because you forget about cards like I've Had Worse. But, that's what saves Tolaasin in the end, the fact that he hits the 1 card in his hand that could prevent him from being flatlined. And it was bold, and, he arguably deserved to be rewarded for that.
Yes, and similarly, big props to Tolaasin for knowing this matchup very well. You'll notice that all 3 I've Had Worses, I believe none of them will play at all.
Yeah.
Tolaasin specifically held all of them in his hand so that they would be net damage fodder, effectively allowing him to draw into his deck clicklessly, which is very important, and also in that scenario, saving him from the Philotic Flatline, which was absolutely a relief, I should say, given there were 2 Neuro EMPs in hand. Before I explain how Jinteki PE could have potentially flatlined Alice Merchant right there, I think we need to first introduce the concept of chunks or packets of damage. Consider the 2 eyes you see on the screen. A Merlin that has a single subroutine that deals 2 net damage, and a pup that has 2 separate subroutines, each dealing 1 damage. For almost all intents and purposes, they are identical, in the sense that they leave the runner with 2 fewer cards in their grip after the net damage is all said and done. But for the purposes of I've Had Worse, they function differently. To be precise, a runner flatline occurs only if the damage of a single chunk of damage exceeds the number of cards in the runner's grip. To illustrate this, assume that the runner has 0 credits and runs on either of these eyes with only a single card in hand, that single card being I've Had Worse. Against a Merlin, if the runner only has a single I've Had Worse in hand, you will compare the damage, in this case 2 net damage, to the number of cards in the runner's hand, which is 1. 2 is greater than 1, therefore the runner is flatlined immediately. Whereas in the case of pup, when you compare the number of cards in the runner's hand, which is 1, to the number of damage that is dealt by the first subroutine, which is 1, well, the damage is not greater than the number of cards in the runner's grip, so the damage is dealt. The runner loses the 1 I've had worse to the net damage, but this is important because by doing so, the I've had worse is triggered, which draws the runner 3 more cards, enabling them to survive the second subroutine that deals 1 net damage. So this is a very subtle but important difference. In the first case, I've had worse doesn't even get a chance to trigger, whereas in the second case, the damage is dealt, and I've had worse draws up the 3 cards before the second subroutine resolves. So yeah, the single packet of 2 net damage is more powerful than many separate packages of damage in this particular case. So we move on to talk about the situation featured in the game, where the runner had a 5-card grip versus the following cards: 2 Neuro EMPs and a Philotic Entanglement, which triggers the identity ability of Personal Evolution. Going by these numbers, you can see that the Corp has the potential to deal 6 net damage, so in theory, this should flatline a runner with a 5-card grip, except that the runner had 1 I've had worse in their hand. So what we can see from this quite easily is that if any of the net damage at any point at all triggers the I've had worse, well, it will draw 3 cards, allowing the runner to have a effective total hit point value of 8 versus the 6 damage. So if the I've had worse is ever triggered, the runner can easily survive the net damage onslaught. And this is the key point to realize when deciding how to play out the turn. So in the Corp's shoes, the ideal play is actually to save your big guns for last. The 3 net damage packet or chunk here is crucial to achieving the flat line, because the 1 damage chunks are very liable to triggering the I've had worse. So what the ideal play that the Corp should do here is to actually fire the Neuro EMPs before scoring the Philotic Entanglement. Assuming the Corp gets lucky, the first Neuro EMP will miss the I've had worse, the second Neuro EMP will also miss the I've had worse. Then you score the Philotic Entanglement. Now notice here that both share the same trigger. When you score the agenda and whenever an agenda is scored, you can see here, both the identity and the agenda share the same trigger. So the player who owns the cards, in this case the Corp, gets to order them. They get to decide which card fires first. In this situation, it is actually ideal to fire the identity ability first, because if you fire the Philotic Entanglement first, they will do 3 damage here, which will guarantee that the I've had worse will be hit, therefore the runner will survive. So you want to actually fire your ID ability first, assuming you get lucky once again. You will whittle the runner down to 2 cards in hand. Then your 3 damage from the Philotic Entanglement will ensure the flatline. So this is basically the only route, the only possible play where the Corp could potentially flatline the runner. And even then, as you notice, we had to assume that the Neuro EMPs and the identity ability all missed the I've had worse, giving the Corp a measly 40% chance to win outright there. But 40% is still better than 0%, and in tight games such as these, you want to take advantage of every opportunity to win the game, no matter how slim it might be. So yeah, very interesting interaction right there. A subtle interaction that, you know, you can't blame BlackCherries for missing at all, because it is very, very unexpected and requires a lot of thinking ahead.
I think, this is a sort of clear lesson that playing slow and playing carefully against PE is much better than playing fast and aggressive, which requires a very different kind of mindset for an Anarch player, particularly a deck like this Alice one that we constructed to try and make lots of runs, pressure centrals a lot. We noticed Tolaasin was very controlled, very measured. He picked his runs very carefully. He often jacked out of runs that he didn't think he could complete successfully. You know, he played this very, very carefully, and it almost didn't work out for him. almost. I mean, allowing that Philotic to get away from him, I think, was a mistake. I may have just eaten the net damage from the Komainu, because worst case scenario, it's an Obokata protocol that you don't steal, but can't kill you. And doesn't win
because you're not
BlackCherries
forced
the game.
to steal it. Yes. Yep. Yeah. And you'll notice that a lot of times, like Tolaasin never once ran archives this entire game, except for the one final run you see here, which obviously wins him the game. Very patient and, you know, dirty laundry as well. You know, he could have easily one of his first dirty laundries, he could have easily targeted the open archives, but he went for HQ instead, knowing that there were probably breach domes in the bin. So a lot of smart plays coming up from Tolaasin this game.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, it was a good showcase for how you change up your strategy on the fly depending on the matchup.
Right, so that was the second win for Tolaasin, which means that he with 2 of 3 wins, he qualifies for the finals. Again, commiserations to BlackCherries, but still a big thank you to BlackCherries for providing us with 2 very awesome, very nail-biting games.
Yeah, really well played.
Yeah, any last words, Tris?
Well, thanks for having me on, Ben, and thanks for allowing me to commentate to 2, I mean, we've said it a lot, but 2 really excellent games. Both really fascinating from both the runner and the core perspective. And I think both great showcases for 2 different styles of Netrunner and 2 different approaches to very complex and very interesting matchups. I was glad to see CTM, you know, one of my favorite corporations. Glad to see it doing well and pulling a win literally out of the fire. And it's always nice to see PE lose. Commiserations to BlackCherries, but as someone who personally despises the identity, you know, I'm quite pleased right now.
You got me this time, Tris. Until next time.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks very much.
Yep, and yeah, to everyone else. So this was the first semi-final games. I'll do my best to cover the rest. So keep a lookout for that. In the meantime, as always, it's goodbye from Tris.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much for watching.
And goodbye from me. Happy net running. Goodbye.